Thumbs up from the tech team. We're good to start. Thank you all so much for coming. We're here to discuss what higher education and basically what a Labour government can do for it. So I hope that's where you think you are, because that's what we're going to talk about. I'm Jamie Gollings. I'm the Deputy Research Director at the Social Market Foundation. We're doing a whole range of events. So in this room, so you could just stay here all day, really. We've got an X handle, like all good things. You can at us at the SMF think tank, and thank as well our sponsor, Russell Group Student Union. You can also tag on the socials. Fire. No fires planned, no fire alarms planned. If there is such a thing happening, then follow the green signs, and that should be okay. But I just want to introduce you to our panel. So we've got Tito Molokwu, General Secretary of the LSE Student Union, Vivienne Stern, CEO of Universities UK, Dr. Michael Spence from UCL, and Tim Roca, MP for Macclesfield. We're going to start off with some remarks from the panel. Tito, why don't you kick us off?
Firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm very excited to be here. I think it's great that there's student voice being represented in this conversation. I did my undergraduate and my postgraduate at LSE, and I only just finished 2 weeks ago, so that's great. But I think that's super important today for this conversation, that young people are actually centred in these conversations. So I think so far in my time as the General Secretary of the LSE Student Union, I've noticed some key issues which really align with the Russell Group Student Union Manifesto for 2024. I noticed that the cost of living crisis is impacting students in so many ways. It's impacting student housing, it's impacting student well-being, it's impacting student engagement with student unions in general. A lot of students are working over 25 hours a week just to pay their rent and their bills. It means that they can't engage with the wider student community. It means that they can't focus on their lectures and their seminars because they're working so hard. I think a lot of students are looking to a Labour government for change and for hope and for innovative ideas. I think in particular, students want Labour to centre them in the conversation. I think students are quite tired of people shaping conversations around maintenance loans when for them it was free at the time when they went to university. I think we need to consider that things have changed. We're in a cost of living crisis. Inflation is just next level, and I think we need to get young people back in the room talking about these issues. So I'm very excited to be here today. And I think what student unions can do best is advocate for student voices. I think that student unions need to make sure that they are the pathway for student voice to the government. I think student unions need to be working better with organisations such as the Russell Group Student Union to make sure that their students are heard.
Great, thanks so much, Tito. Vivienne, would you like to say something?
Thanks. Well, I was going to make 3 points, but before I do, just to pick up on the point you just made, I think there may be an opportunity to start to get the generation of people who benefited from a free higher education, and I include myself in that, to think about supporting universities and the generation of students coming through. I think there's a group of people who are now becoming, sufficiently, have reached a point in their lives when they ought to be thinking about philanthropy, and that's an audience we should be building support for giving back to universities amongst. And I'd like to it's one of the things I'd like to kind of raise a flag on, kind of changing the attitude towards philanthropic giving to universities. So I just want to make that point before I immediately forget, which I will. The 3 things that I guess I want to talk about very briefly are, first of all, support for students while they are studying. Secondly, the experience that students get from going to university. And thirdly, access and participation. And I'll sort of maybe start with that last point. Coming to Liverpool, I had a bit of a flashback to the way that I felt this time last year. And this time last year, the Labour Party gathered here in Liverpool just after a Conservative Party conference in which Rishi Sunak had said that the expansion of the university system was the biggest policy mistake of the last 30 years. And I perhaps take my job too seriously, because I spent a week feeling sort of sick. I mean, it just felt to me like such an incredible statement that the Prime Minister, in a moment where we have some policy challenges, I would say, 1 or 2, would identify that as the greatest error. Knowing what I know, which is that you're still basically twice as likely to go to university if you're from the most affluent backgrounds compared to the least affluent, that the participation rates vary colossally depending on geography. So, you know, everybody likes to quote the fact that if you're an 18-year-old from certain parts of West London, 70% are going to go to university. If you're from Barrow and Furness, it's 13%. Now, is it that because kids in Barrow and Furness are that much less likely to be able to benefit from higher education, or less clever, or is something else going on? Why is participation going backwards in Wales? You know, if you are like me and you're pretty sure that going to university opened up a set of doors that would simply have been closed to you otherwise, I'm not first in the family, but my mother was, and I'm guessing in most rooms, if you asked people to stick up their hand and say, were you first in your family to go to university? There's a kind of slightly more youthful audience in this room. So I'm guessing that if I asked the question, was your mum or dad first in their family, most of you would probably, you'd get most of, can I do that?
Yeah.
Are you either first in your own family, or were your parents the first in their family to go to university? So that's basically most of the room. So you kind of, you fall into a category of people who probably believe that this thing makes a big difference to your ability to succeed in life. And not just that, to the choice that you have about what you do. So I think we've got unfinished business, and I think that to be able to work with a government that sees that and viscerally understands that, because so many people in the front bench, you know, have lived that, and who don't believe it should be down to kind of luck, that they kind of sneaked through somehow undetected and ended up in you know, highly selective institutions and in around the cabinet table, that should be a shared mission. So, you know, if we're talking about welfare for students, that's got to be a very big part of what we're about. The second thing is maintenance. Now, you've probably, we talk a lot about index linking the tuition fee in England, and I will talk about that in just a second. But we have said consistently that if you are going to do that, and we think in England you should, at the very least, link the tuition fee to inflation, you should do that alongside addressing the fact that the maintenance funding available to students has fallen way behind inflation, and actually that if you are from the lowest income backgrounds, you graduate with the largest amount of debt because you take out the largest loan. So reintroducing grants for those from the lowest income backgrounds, and addressing the extent to which maintenance loans keep pace with inflation are, in our view, just as important as index linking the fee. Because if students are spending too much time doing part-time work, if they are unable to make a choice about where they study, they feel that they're constrained to study locally and not, you know, as I did, that the world was their oyster, we got a problem. But then the final point I would make is that you have to see the resources that universities have to teach students as being a student issue too. It's not about, you know, universities sort of trousering large amounts of cash at the expense of students. You want a higher education system in which the next generation of students have the same high quality and high contact, quite intensive and personalised, accepting that there's a kind of variety of experience and not everything is everywhere is perfect all at once. But by and large, we've got a system which does put quite a lot of resource into supporting students, not only to get through the door, but to succeed, to complete a course, to do well academically, to have other experiences alongside their academic studies, and then to sort of make a transition into the labour market. Of course, things could be better, but if we continue to erode the funding universities have to put behind the education of students suffer too. So that is as much of an issue as the maintenance issue, and I think that's why it shouldn't be about, you know, students versus universities in this debate. And I better stop talking.
Thanks so much. Michael, if I could bring you in there.
Yeah, look, it seems to me that partnership is really important, and I was impressed by what Tito was saying about putting students at the centre, because I think that is one of the partnerships. The first is obviously about partnership with government. So we don't have much in this country. We're a funny little windswept island in the North Atlantic. We don't grow anything, we don't make anything, we don't dig anything out of the ground. All we've got is clever people, and we have enormously innovative and well-educated people. And it so happens that right now at this point in the global economic cycle, that is the best thing that you could possibly have. And so for government to see both research and education as priorities for the country is for me a no-brainer. But you've got to think about those things together, and you've got to think about those things in partnership with the university. So for example, part of the reason there is a virtuous cycle between research and education in that students get a better education in research-rich environments, but it's also true that the reputation of universities is partly built on their research, and that's important for the student and for their future earning capacity. You know, that's why Michael Spence, not me, but the other one, got the Nobel Prize. So there is this virtual connection, but we also know that part of the problem, part of the pressure on funding teaching comes from the underfunding of research. And so thinking about those two things together with government is important for the sector. We cannot simply load more debt on students. That is clear, and yet we need to find an answer to the current funding problems. The second really is about partnership with other organisations, both across government and more generally. So one of the things that's happened during my long career in universities is that universities are expected to do more and more. You know, there was a time when universities were expected to put on lectures and run exams and have a library and a laboratory, and that was about it. Now both students and the community more generally legitimately expect universities to provide all sorts of other services in relation to the mental health of students, or their career prospects, or their whole suite of things that the funding model doesn't really provide for. Now, partly universities have to make sure that they've got the right priorities and that they are prioritising looking after students as well as they possibly can. But also we need to think about the seams in the system. So we've just launched a whole new mental health strategy, for example, that works in very close partnership with our local NHS, because we found that it was the coordination of services as between the university and the local publicly available services that was often the problem. And giving students clear pathways for care of various kinds through not only our part, as it were, of the support network, but also more generally was really important. And there's a whole set of other examples where we've been working with other community organisations in similar kinds of ways. And the third thing, obviously, is partnership with students. In a context of limited resources, it's really important to know what's important to students. And that sounds obvious, but lots of universities invest lots in rowing. I rowed, I love rowing, that's great, but it might not be where a great percentage of your students are thinking about where the university should be putting its resources. Lots of universities invest in all sorts of things that they've invested in a very long time, because they're not having dynamic conversations with their students about what a student life that prepares them now looks like. That's why we've just written a new student life strategy in consultation with our consultation is the wrong word, in partnership with our student union. For us, that's a very radical thing, because we used to just give the student union a chunk of change and then go off and say, go off and enjoy yourself, and if you can't enjoy yourself in London, then you're a bit of a loser. But now we are working much more closely, and that was great because it led to whole generations of fabulous student leadership. But now we're working much more closely with our student union to say, well, where should we be spending the money? What are the things that are important to you as between careers and mental health services, as between clubs and activities and other sorts of both co-curricular and extracurricular things. So I think partnership is the trick, and that's why to think not only about partnership with government and with community organisations, but particularly with students, I think is important for institutions at the moment.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. Tim, what are your reflections on what you've heard so far?
So I'm not a minister, I'm a backbench MP, so I'm able to get away with a little bit more than others. So I'll start off with just declaring some interest. The first is I was a student union sabbatical officer a long time ago in another life, and I really value student unions and the student voice. I think they're really, really important. I'd start off by saying I'm heartened that Peter Kyle has talked about the importance of HE in the sector, because you're right, Vivienne, the language from the previous government was really antagonistic, and the policies they introduced are incredibly antagonistic as well. And I think understanding how lucky we are in this country that we have a world-leading HE sector is really important, not only because it provides 750,000 jobs, I think across the UK, tens of billions of pounds in value added, but there are colleagues of mine sitting on the backbenches who their university will be a crucial employer in their town or city, and it's crucial to the success of their local economy. So this is a really important sector, and we need to value it, and we have to start off by saying that. The second thing I would say is there's not been enough at this conference criticism of our Liberal Democrat colleagues. We are in the situation we're in partly because of a system that they colluded with the Conservatives to create in coalition over 10 years ago. I wasn't a fan of fees. I marched against fees when I was a student officer. If I could start the system again, I don't think I would start with fees, to be honest. But we are where we are, and unfortunately we've created a system that is actually increasingly regressive. It is not fair on students in the way that they're being charged. People on lower incomes are having to pay much more back than those on higher incomes. So the system is not only broken, it's regressive, and we're here to talk about fairness today, and that's a really important point. There is a spending review coming up. There is going to be a bun fight. There is no money. The economy is clearly crucial for our success in terms of kickstarting growth, and the HE sector is really important for that. And there was a report from Onward. I shouldn't quote centre-right think tanks, but it did talk about spin-offs yesterday, and a decline in spin-offs from universities. So there's work to do on our growth agenda with universities. But there is going to be a huge discussion about priorities for funding. And universities have to have a strong voice at that table in arguing that actually we don't put enough money into the HE sector. We are down the league tables in terms of the OECD for the amount of public sector support there is for these fantastic institutions. I would say as well, though, that universities had a sort of golden era in terms of finance, certainly at the beginning of the fees system. In real terms, I think funding for universities is up 200% since the 1990s. But they're delivering a lot more, which is the point that I completely appreciate that Michael was making earlier. But the public sector has gone through really significant retrenchment in the last 15 years, and there will be an argument for some that will be made to government that perhaps universities need to tighten their belts and make sure they really are delivering value for money. And I'm sure many are, but there will be that argument in the spending review as well, and I'm sure Vice-Chancellor's pay will be trotted out and all the usual tropes. So for me, I want to see our universities properly funded. I want to see maintenance of our students properly provided for. And I would like in the argument to see public funding increase. But I'm very, very aware that there are going to be lots of people arguing for their part of the public sector to be better funded as well.
Great, thanks Tim. We will be going shortly to audience questions, but I get to ask some first ones, I'm afraid. Tito, just want to bring you in on the kind of the discussion around fees and costs and that kind of thing. Vivienne sort of laid out her vision, with sort of higher tuition fees, but more, but the reintroduction of maintenance grants. What do you think that would mean for students, and what would be your take on that?
I think that there are several things you said which I really agree with. I think that increasing tuition fees, it doesn't really target the root of the problem, in my opinion. I think that students and myself are aware, money doesn't grow on trees, but I think increasing tuition fees, it continues the cycle of student poverty, and I think in particular, I think it ostracises students from these free school meals backgrounds, students from families that are working class who can't access higher education already. And I think at the root of the problem is a lack of public spending on higher education. I think that students want high quality teaching, students want great research institutions, students want a great student union, and of course that costs money. So I think that we need to start looking more to public spending instead of putting the burden for that on students. But I do agree that I think reintroducing maintenance grants for students from really low socioeconomic backgrounds is a really good solution, I think.
Sure, thanks, Tito. Tim, I mean, you spoke about, you wouldn't have, this isn't the system you'd have designed if you had a chance. I mean, is there an opportunity to change the system now, or what would you?
We've had plenty of reviews, haven't we? That's one of the problems. We've had lots of discussion and policy, but nothing fundamentally has changed, and there's been tinkering. I've lost track of what are the terms of a Plan 5, or Plan 2, or what have you. It is an expensive system that we have for students at the moment. I think state university systems in parts of the United States now are actually cheaper than being a student in the UK. Part of it, the motivation for it, was trying to move debt off the books of government, and clearly that failed several years ago when the NAO ruled that the loan book had to sit on the government's balance sheet. And it's £250 billion now, rising probably to £500 billion by the end of this decade. Is there a possibility of a fundamental review? Potentially. I don't know, I'm not privy to those conversations, but clearly there needs to be reform because the unit of resource is stagnating, students are not being supported properly, and it's a world-leading sector that we want to see succeed.
Absolutely. Vivienne, I wanted to talk a bit about housing as well. So I was on one of the panels this morning, was around the private rental sector, and students got raised as sort of people who can suffer in that system. I just wondered what more students, universities could do, the sector could do to sort of support students' rights in that area, and what role they're taking or what role they should take.
So I really like that question, but I'm going to answer a completely different one. The point about the balance between public and private investment is a really important one. So England is an outlier even within the UK in the extent to which the costs of higher education are shouldered by the graduate. And what's happened since the financial crash is that the concept of the income contingent loans scheme was a kind of shared payment model where the public invested alongside the graduate, and the balance has swung too far in the direction of the graduate. So when I talk about index linking the fee, UUK has sort of said, look, okay, if you wanted this system not to be in deficit on the teaching side, this is broadly speaking what it would cost you, and the figure is somewhere between 12 and 13,000 per student, and that obviously varies by subject, but on average it would be about that. We are absolutely explicitly not arguing that should all come out of the student and graduate loan repayment system. We do think that there is an argument for the public purse to step back in to fund teaching costs up front through the T grant, which historically was how that part of how that co-payment system worked. Inflation linking the fee, though, just stops it going down every single year in real terms. And I think that's different from sort of, I think, I would argue that's not putting the fee up, it's stopping it going down in value every single year. The other thing I would just say, picking up on colleagues' comments, is that we've all got to just, I want to send everybody to the kind of University of Martin Lewis, because we talk about students paying. This is not a student payment system, it's a graduate payment system. It's an income contingent graduate repayment system. So it is designed to be, you're right that it has become less progressive with Plan 5, but it is designed to be progressive in the sense that those people who earn the most pay the most. Those people who earn the least pay the least. So it doesn't matter what your background was when you went to university. That's irrelevant. What matters is what happens to you post-graduation. And it's 9% above the threshold for 40 years now. So it protects you against what might happen in the labour market. I've got a really good colleague who's been in hospital for 6 months. He's not paying his student loan back whilst, recovering from... That's one of the protections that exist. But to come to your point about accommodation, yes, it really matters. We've had we've had a period in which pressure on student housing has been a real issue in many systems. In many cities rather, there are some good examples of universities working collaboratively with local authorities around housing supply. We just have to make sure that in protecting the rights of students in the system, that we don't end up creating a kind of a different problem which drives people out of the lettings market and increases the pressure on supply. So there has to be a balance between making sure that students are protected by the system without stifling supply.
Can I also say something about the whole question about efficiency in universities, because I think it comes to the position of students too. So in an environment, what makes universities expensive is this notion that it's good to teach people in a research active environment. So if you think about the costs of research, you don't get all the direct and certainly not all the indirect costs of a research grant. But more importantly than that, you don't get anything for the 40% of people's time that they've traditionally spent on research, on a standard 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service and administration contract. So that model is very expensive to run, and it's different to the model that existed in the 1990s, where a lot of students who are now educated in universities were in essentially teaching institutions. And universities are much more expensive to run than high schools and much more expensive to run than teaching institutions because of this combination of teaching and research. How have universities dealt with that? Well, if you are my university, what you've done is prioritised the quality of research and the student experience over everything else. What does that mean? It means that you end up with £200 million of occupational health and safety required backlog repairs and maintenance, because every year you've chipped just a little bit off capital expenditure. It also means that a lecturer at UCL is paid less than the person who at the University of Sydney used to open my mail and welcome people to the office and offer them a cup of coffee. So prioritising the interests of students and quality research, but driving efficiency in an environment of diminishing resource, universities have fought to keep this teaching and research vision, that Humboldtian thing that in fact you're better being educated in that environment, going. And I think that's a major question, and that's why the former Prime Minister's comments were shocking, but they raised an interesting question, which is, can we afford to educate 40% of the population, or 50 or whatever, 60 or whatever our goal might be, in that kind of expensive environment? I sure hope we can, but if we can, we need to sink resources into it. And that's why comparisons with the numbers from the early 1990s are sort of misleading, because they don't take into account the enormous growth of the sector and expectations of the sector in the most expensive post-secondary activity that you can have. And a really radical government might say, well, let's think about reviewing all post-secondary experience, ask for whom this particular kind of educational experience, that is the university experience, is appropriate, and maybe at the same time think about what they're doing about further education, which of course is fundamentally broken in England, and fundamentally broken because it's been even more starved of funding than universities have. And students get caught, and that's why simply saying we're going to whack another however many thousand on student fees and expect students to pay it is not the answer.
Tim, we touched on reforms of the system. We did a sort of piece of research recently that was speaking to young people, and we found that people's understanding, sort of a quarter of people didn't really fully understand the student loan system, you know, and particularly disadvantaged young people were more inclined to think that they could go bankrupt from the student loan system.
Yeah.
How much of this is unhelpful terminology? I mean, there's unhelpful terminology. The student loan concept feels like, you know, can be putting off people from disadvantaged backgrounds perhaps, or sort of people who are more sort of afraid of debt. How much could, you know, some of those sort of tweaks to language or that kind of thing help? And yeah, to reflect any of the points.
I think the graduate tax is effectively what it's become in some ways. And so I think it is helpful that we talk about the language that we use. But graduates now, they still use that language. They talk about, I owe £50,000. And it does put people off, of course it does. As to the points about efficiency, I think you're right. I mean, I didn't declare it, I also worked in higher education for 15 years at King's and at the University of Westminster latterly. And I think there will be a conversation in government about efficiency in the sector, and I think that the sector will have to make its argument that it is a well-run part of the public sector. But as I say, there are newspapers out there that will bring out the old tropes about high pay and highly paid VCs, etc., because unfortunately universities, despite being, as we said at the start, a really important sector for the UK and also for the new Labour government's growth mission, they're being dragged into the culture war. In 10 different ways, HE is being dragged into the culture war. So, you know, I think universities have to be confident in making the arguments that they need to make, and also confident that now in government, with people like Peter, they've got allies, whereas before I don't think they did.
Tito, just bringing on that housing discussion. I mean, you know, in LSE, there's a lot of people facing sort of London rents as students. What's been your experience with LSE and with students sort of suffering these kinds of issues, and sort of the level of support you've seen from LSE for renters fighting for their rights?
I think that's a great question. I think a lot of students in LSE and in the wider universities feel as though they're treated differently as tenants than the average tenant because of their student status. I think it's often hard to be taken seriously by landlords, by housing ombudsmen. I think people feel like their voices are not heard. I also noticed that a lot of students are not aware of their rights as tenants. So a lot of students don't know about, like, the national code, for example. They don't know about standards of living. Mould is not acceptable. They don't know how to contest with a rent increase. And I think that the support for students as tenants has not been sufficient at all, and I think it shows that there's a lack of communication with the government and student unions in general. I think that this is a sector in which student unions could work better with the government, with student housing. I also think that the Renters' Rights Bill, for example, would be very, very transformative for students. I think that a lot of students fear homelessness, which is a very real reality. I think for some people they might never think that they could even be homeless, but actually you could just be evicted for no reason and no fault of your own, which is a very scary reality for a lot of students I've spoken to at LSE. And also LSE, of course, is one of the most privileged UK universities, so if that's what I'm hearing, then I can imagine what it's like for students in other universities in the UK. So I definitely think that with regards to student housing, students need to be taken seriously as tenants, the same as any other tenant in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, thanks, Tito. I'm going to go to the audience now. So if you've got any questions, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Vivienne's point about the fact that in higher education, the people who benefit the most pay the most, and then Tim sort of referring to the way in which student loans are paid back at being a graduate tax. And I sort of wanted to pose the question to the panel that why is a graduate tax not being considered? Because the reality is that people who benefit the most from their education aren't paying the most, because for a lot of people, university compared to the private schools they went to is a huge discount. They can pay for it up front and they're not repaying it back with a loan, and they're not having that sort of on their conscience, because I understand that you can't go bankrupt from it, but it is a heavy weight on your shoulders. So yeah, why not a graduate tax? Because I think this is certainly more appealing than the current RPI interest and the payback period, which is now 40 years long and at £25,000, which is quite regressive.
Great, thanks so much. We'll take a couple more and then we'll go back to the panel. Yeah.
Michael, I thought your stuff about the increasing expectations on universities was very interesting, but I want to pose a question, which is, in 10 years' time, would it be better to call for the government to continue to fund what amounts to the kind of all-inclusive holiday, where universities are expected to do everything, leisure facilities, housing, transport and so on? Or would it be better in 10 years' time to free universities up just to do teaching and research and get every other bit of the state which currently ignores students to step up?
Interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about, we've heard a lot about, maintenance not going up as much as it should have over time, but we haven't heard as much about the parental income thresholds. And whilst it's been talked about that, in theory students should have enough that they can go to university regardless of their backgrounds, the fact is that people in families who earn more than £25,000 are being asked to contribute when actually those families are, really very low income and are very unlikely to be able to give their kids support to be able to do that. So I guess I wondered the panel's views on that and how we make sure that that question also comes out in the debate and it isn't just the overall maintenance levels going up, but also that those parental income thresholds move.
Okay, great, thanks so much. Okay, Vivienne, would you like to take another of those?
You're right about parental income thresholds. You're dead right about it. I mean, one of the things that's slightly horrifying is when you start totting it all up, the kind of the cost to the Treasury of addressing all of these problems becomes quite quickly quite big. But you are dead right about that, and it is something that we continually failed to bring into the discussion. So thank you for mentioning it. I think Jim's point about public services stepping in to support students adequately, it's one of the arguments we'll make in the blueprint that, Michael mentioned the degree to which universities invest in student mental health services. If you had, adequate support through the CAM system for students, you would have less weight placed on universities. However, I really struggle with this. I think Michael's absolutely right to identify the way that the expectations on institutions have shifted, and so a lot of what we say goes into teaching students isn't what you would describe really as teaching, it's the kind of wraparound stuff. Having said that, do I think it's likely that the NHS is going to be able to provide the services that students really need? I feel a bit bleak about that, to be completely honest. And I think that the real struggle is, whilst the kind of hawkish bit of me would say, you know what, 18-year-olds who arrive on university campus in many cases can expect 24/7 mental health support in a way that an 18-year-old who doesn't go to university, absolutely no question they would get anything like that support. So why are we doing this to ourselves? And I think you would think that right up until you were Vice-Chancellor of university where there was a student suicide. And then you would think, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent that happening whilst I am, duty of care is a whole other conversation. But so I think it's a conversation we need to start having. On graduate tax is like PQA. If you're not a policy wonk, you will have no idea what I'm talking about. The graduate tax bus will come around again. I hope we don't have another review because frankly I'm bored of reviews of higher education. I've taken part in too many of them. Graduate tax, the Treasury doesn't like hypothecating tax. So really what a graduate tax would, and first of all what we've got, bless him, Nick Barr, LSE, Professor of Economics, who invented the income contingent loan repayment system. If he was in the room, he'd be kind of bouncing up and down and saying it is a graduate tax. It's a time-limited graduate tax. It's a graduate tax with additional protections for the people who contribute to it. He would say, and rightly so, that we are idiots, those of us who've had responsibility for higher education policy in the last 15 years, because we've missed not one but two opportunities to frame this income contingent payment scheme in a way that is understood by those, in the way that I think it is in Australia, the kind of HECS system, higher education contribution scheme, is understood to be a contribution. It is a co-payment system. And it's one that you don't pay on the door when you enter higher education. We've totally bungled that twice. And my guess is we'll probably bungle it a third time. And Nick Barr will, his little disappointed face is so hard to deal with because he's right. I think I should stop talking.
I don't know what he looks like, but I've got something in my head.
And it's not a good, with the RPI rate of interest, it's not a good deal to pay your fees up front. You're actually better off taking the loan, but that requires some.
Yeah.
Any other questions you want to talk to, Michael?
So I think your question is a really interesting one, and partly depends upon the changing competitive landscape of higher we had UCL in a recent study was demonstrated too, but it's a kind of real decent study, and even our economists think it's too conservative, add an extra 9.6 billion pounds a year to the UK economy. We have the same economic impact on the UK economy, much of it outside London, as having a London Olympics every year. Right? Obviously, a big part of that is we are a huge international education services provider. If I were being cynical, I could say we're a huge international educational services provider that does a bit of domestic education and research as a charity. And at this point, all the media people say, "Oh no, don't!" So please don't quote me. But you know better than anybody that that's the reality of the UK education system. As online education happens more and more, teaching-intensive institutions internationally will become online accreditation agencies of one kind or another. The places with the $40 billion endowments will continue to do the $40 billion endowment experience, and American movies will be made about them. The places like ours, large comprehensive metropolitan universities, for them a lot of the competitive advantage will be in questions like, how can you leverage the social capital of the institution to create career opportunities for your graduates through alumni connections and through the rest of it? What do you, how does the innovation ecosystem that you are developing, and fun fact, our latest we've just had a unicorn in the AI area, but my favourite recent spin out is one where you have one injection for haemophilia and you never need a blood transfusion again, and the So how does that innovation ecosystem benefit our students? So at UCL we have one of the largest student entrepreneurship programs actually in the world, with some extraordinary outcomes. And so it's the things that were traditionally thought of as wraparound and the on-campus experience that are going to differentiate you from the online education providers and be your competitive advantage, both domestically and also internationally, in the competition to provide educational services. And that's going to be hard to shift. And it's not just government. It's in government, the global consumers of education services, and the wretched makers of American college films who sell the story of the holistic experience, in which I profoundly agree. And I partly profoundly agree because I meet so many of our alumni who say, the education at UCL was great, world class, but the thing that really transformed my life was being president of the Latvian Society, or whatever it might be, the 400 and something clubs and societies we have on campus.
Tito, any of those you want to reflect on those questions?
Yeah, I think the question about graduate tax was a really good question, and I think it's a good reminder that a lot of students are unaware of how graduate repayment works in general, and I think there's a need for us to work on educating students on what a loan means. I think in particular students who might have parents who had a completely different system when they went to university, or maybe they have parents who didn't go to university, are hearing two different things. They're hearing one thing when they're signing up to enroll at university, and then they're hearing another thing at home. And I think that alone is very off-putting for students from working class backgrounds, or students who they're the first person to go to university. I think that I can just imagine it being framed as, oh, you do a 3-year course and then you have to pay it back immediately. And that sounds terrifying if you've never experienced that, or if your parents have never experienced that. So I think we need to work on how we reframe that conversation. I'm hoping that Labour will work with student unions to make sure that we are educating students on how the graduate tax and the graduate repayment system is working.
Yeah. What do you think, Tim? Can we just sort of reshape it a little bit, make it look a bit more like, make that happy Batman in my brain look a bit happier, and just reframe it slightly so students are understanding it better?
Potentially, because there isn't the appetite to unravel the system now and go for a graduate tax. I don't think that's what the government will be looking at all. And actually, very importantly, at least one of the advantages of the fee system is because it is hypothecated, the money's protected, and a future treasury isn't down the path taking the money away from universities. But going back to the central point here, public funding for institutions is down 60% from the last 10 years, and that's really the problem that's at the core of this, and the way that we've shifted, as Vivienne said, too much of the burden across to students. We've not talked much about cross-subsidy so far today, and the importance of international students. I think that's an important element that we need to talk about, and be proud that we've got these amazing institutions that attract students from all over the world, and also be drawing out the advantages, not just financially and sort of supporting domestic education, but the soft power advantages it gives the UK as well, which is really important.
Absolutely.
Oh, huge. I mean, we're preparing British students to be actors in a global commercial and political environment. What better way of doing it than making friends all over the world? And when you go to one of our alumni events in Beijing or Lima, they're like St. George's Day parties. I mean, there's a tremendous affection for this country in some of the biggest economies in the world. That's got to be good for the UK. Why wouldn't you want that to happen?
Let's just go back out to the audience. Any more questions we can pick up? Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to jump off the point about student loans. And so for me, as a first generation to university, luckily I had a good perspective, and my family had a good perspective on the loan, seeing it as a graduate tax. But one of the realizations I had when arriving at Oxford was the vast number of my peers had their parents to support them through that. And one of the issues I think which is biggest in the UK right now is the erosion of the middle class. So for me, as someone who's grown up completely working class, trying to transcend and mobilize, one of the big issues for me will be my future prospects, my income, and the ability to get on the housing ladder as one of those key things. Yes. And so the ability to leave debt-free, which I haven't been fortunate enough compared to my peers who came from wealthy and affluent backgrounds, will mean that I arrive slower. I'm going to enter the middle class slower, and I'm going to be behind my peers who are already rich in their pursuit of gaining greater wealth. So although it's true there is this aspect of a graduate tax, it's only a graduate tax on a proportion of of our society. And already those who, as was mentioned before, privately educated, 7% of our country, already outperform in every single key area, politics, journalism, civil service. They're already doing better than us in every regard, and already being able to leave debt-free, enter the middle class, or continue their journey through the middle class, accumulate capital for themselves, will mean that they're better off compared to me, despite if we work at the same job, having the same degree from the same university.
Great, thanks so much. Go ahead.
So my question would be around actually student finance, and we spoke a lot about graduate tax and funding universities, but at the end of the day, the student loan, the maintenance loan, hasn't increased proportionally to inflation over the last couple of years. And the caps on the, based on obviously how it's assigned, the lowest, the max loan you can get is if both of your family and household income is 25,000, which is very low. It's basically one person's minimum wage. So I think my question would be around, is Labour going to be trying to look at student finance and whether the maintenance loan should go up? Because the current maintenance loan structure means that you basically can't pay rent, you can't sustain yourself during your time at university, and that's what happens. Students like me have to go out, when I was a student, and work 40 hours a week, and educate yourself, and work 40 hours a week, and then be part of the student life. So what would you be looking in terms of that, and also the caps on who gets what kind of loan?
Great, thanks so much. And one more at the back.
So we're kind of in the room of the bigger universities here, so I'm curious how we can implement things into the Labour government to make sure whatever decisions are being made filtered all the way down to the smallest universities, so every student has the same fair experience.
Yeah, perfect, great, thanks. Tito, any of those you want to take?
Yes, I really liked your point about the maintenance loans. It's definitely a broken system, a very broken system, and I think the thresholds need to be reviewed. I also think it's important to talk about this with regards to our postgraduate students, because I think that funding for undergraduate students is obviously it's broken, but for postgraduate students I think it's even worse. I just did my master's and the maximum funding I could get from Student Finance England was £12,000, but my tuition fees cost £17,000. So already that's not including rent, bills, living, it's already not enough. So I definitely think that there needs to be a review of thresholds and how that's calculated, and I think taking into account in particular postgrads and international students is very important.
Great, thanks. Michael?
I think the point about an equality of an equity of student experience across different institutions is really important. And one of the problems with a sector as large as the UK is that the demands on different types of universities in different contexts is both geographic and social are hugely different. And successive governments, both here and elsewhere, have tried to find ways of enabling mission differentiation that meant that you didn't get punished by sort of one-size-fits-all funding formulas and policy frameworks. No government has successfully done that. And that's why if we were to have a review, like you, Vivienne, I'm sick of higher education reviews, but I think if we were to have a review, it needs to be a post-secondary experience review that asks some big questions about the very diverse range of things that people do in providing training for people at the post-secondary stage. And that would include not only universities with different sorts of missions, but also, as I keep rabbiting on, further education providers who haven't been well looked after in this country.
Vivienne?
So there are two extremely interesting questions. I mean, I think I'm just going to endorse what you said, because the only thing I would say about student maintenance is my understanding from what both Bridget Phillipson and Jackie Smith have said privately is that they absolutely get the need to address student maintenance support. I don't think, Jim will probably know what Jackie Smith has said on the fringe because I haven't been in any public session. Yeah. So I think that point has been lodged. Your question is a really, really interesting and
so
good
you're not
one.
allowed to tweet my joke about international education, but you can tweet that.
You know, and I don't think I can really answer it adequately, except to say that if you were just an economist and you didn't worry about politics, you would prevent people paying their loans up front. Because those people, we know that the kind of advantage that you inherit persists into later life, and therefore it's quite likely that those people whose parents have the means to pay their loan up front will go into jobs that are highly paid. And they are the people who, I mean, to a lesser extent than the Plan 5, but they overpay. Don't tell anybody, but they do. It's a progressive system which is designed to get those people who earn high salaries to pay slightly more than the cost of supporting them through higher education in order to kind of even out the public subsidy for those who never pay back their loan. So if you just thought about the economics of it, you'd prevent people paying off their loans up front. Now, it doesn't actually make any sense for a parent to do that, and Martin Lewis does a heroic job of trying to explain that to parents, and nobody knows what their career trajectory is likely to be, so I would say take your chances, honey bun. But from a Treasury point of view, it's disadvantageous. Your question is much more interesting than that, right? I have said that I think that we should index link the fee, and I think it should stop going down. I also think that the public should step back in. Do you know what really worries me? If I take off my my boss is sitting behind you, so I have to be a bit careful about this, but if I took off my higher education hat, what really worries me is we've got an ageing society, we've got a falling birth rate, and we've got people, I look around my office, which is populated by people very largely in their kind of mid-20s and early 30s, and what I mostly think is, why aren't you having babies? But I know the answer to that because
I've
they're
got
afraid...
8 children.
Okay, you're doing your bit. But babies are really expensive, and you need to have, you know, a degree of sort of security before you start thinking that you can, you know, you can take on that responsibility. And so I'm not putting any pressure on you. My daughter's 17, and I keep on saying, when are you going to have children? She goes, oh! I'm obviously, I don't mean now, but, you know, but we do have to think about the interaction between this policy sort of environment and the propensity of people to have children. Because an ageing society with a falling birth rate is a trap we don't want to be in.
So the other solution to that, of course, is to have generous routes into migration for people who paid shed loads of cash for an education in the UK, who are educated in the UK in English to in professions that we need, but no government has managed to do the left hand and the right hand in that kind of way. So often we do the 2 years and then send people home, and then employ people and then bring people in for example, qualified professions in the NHS, where they haven't been trained in the UK or in our system, and they need so it is again about sort of coordination between different parts of the system.
Absolutely.
And we should perhaps say thank you to the Labour government for having made a difference, I think an appreciable difference to international student recruitment by the positive messages.
The language,
that made a difference.
Yeah.
There you go, Tim. Thank you already for the party. Any closing thoughts on this, or indeed pronatalism, or any other?
Yeah. Well,
the other big topic you want to share?
Well, I think I won't touch on that one, but just building on that last point, I think one of the things that has to change, and this is why growth is the centre of the government's mission in what it wants to achieve, is the Northwest, where we are now, has the same number of graduate jobs today as it had 15 years ago. So we're producing amazing graduates, but into an economy that isn't working for graduates. In the United States, the graduate journey is much, much better. There are far more jobs, and 10 years after leaving university, you're earning a much higher salary. So we've got to fix the economy so people have got decent jobs to go into. And then finally, just referring back to what I said before about being a student union officer, I've been quite heartened, and there are plenty of old student union wonks in the room as well, sorry Jim, is actually, it's good to see that we still have a thriving student union sector that's standing up and representing students properly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for being a lovely audience. We're at the Association Market Foundation, need to do a bit of a plug. We have this great newsletter called Want Week. If you want to follow this debate, pronatalism, any debate you can think of, every week we chew over all the think tanks reports, obviously ours are also in there. And we sort of give them a little weekly digest. You can find it on the SMF website, so recommend that. Also, if you want to watch back, reflect on the great time we've had together, this has been recorded and will be found on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with your friends, and makes a great Christmas gift. But thank you so much, and we've got some food, some watermelon, and some fries, if you want to partake. And thank you for our panel. It's been great.